On behalf of our Board of Trustees, it's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening to this, the 23rd Annual Baltimore Sun Foreign Policy Panel. Our debt of gratitude to the Baltimore Sun is enormous. There's probably no other organization in the city that happens to overlap as much with the central purpose of our organization, citizen education and international affairs, as does the Baltimore Sun. And the Sun has had advisors to us from before the council was founded. Two of its family were at the founding meeting of this council. Perry Bolton, a vice president of the Sun, and Brad Jacobs, then editor of the editorial page of the Evening Sun, and Donald Patterson, when publisher, all served terms as chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Baltimore Council. The Sun has been a corporate benefactor of the Sun, of the Council, since 1980. And perhaps we're as much indebted as anything for this particular panel, which we've had 22 times before this evening. Joe Stern, who was editor of the editorial page of the Sun, chaired this panel for almost 2 decades. And Jeff Price did it for several years, and Robert Ruby is with us this evening. The debt, as I say, is enormous. I think Marion Cordry is with us. Her late husband, Charlie, of course, was one of our wise and witty and charming members of the panel for many, many years. Well, in any case, we're deeply indebted to the Baltimore Sun. Pleased to have this association. We look forward to this evening's panel with great interest. I started to say the ripples from Iraq will be with us for a long time. It's really the waves from Iraq will dominate our thinking for a very, very long time. And so the topic is huge and profoundly interesting. To present Mr. Ruby tonight is the publisher of the Baltimore Sun, Denise Palmer.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be with you all tonight. I'm looking forward to hearing the panel as well. Robert gave me the shortest intro that you will have ever heard, so you'll be thankful for that. He's been the Sun's foreign editor since August of 2001. Prior to that, he worked as the paper's European correspondent for 4 years, as its Middle East correspondent for 5 years, including several stints in Iraq. He's also the author of books about the Middle East and the Arctic. And I have to tell you that having a number of people in Iraq over the last few months, it made us much more comfortable that we had somebody like Robert back here in the newsroom directing those efforts, because he's been there and he knows what it's like. And you'll hear a little bit about what they went through tonight. Hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's good to see everybody here. Unfortunately, right when I was walking in, I was handed some very disturbing news. When we leave this building tonight and leave the downtown area, there's not going to be any electricity in the whole region. That extends down to Washington, D.C. No one knows when it's going to be back. We're not going to have any running water. The phone service is going to be out. Again, no one knows for how long. This could be for days, it could be for months. That's landlines and cell phones. The banks are not going to open tomorrow. The stock market is going to be closed indefinitely. There's always a silver lining. There aren't going to be any Social Security checks in the mail, and indeed there's not going to be any mail. Every government office is going to remain shuttered. The courthouse records here and in Towson and Annapolis and Ellicott City, they're all gone. The computers are gone. All the offices are just wrecked. The really scary thing is that the police are gone. They've just melted away. If you make it home, I hope you have good neighbors. I hope you have a gun and know how to use it, because you are on your own. It's worth contemplating that scenario. No electricity, no phones, no water, no jobs. Let's say it was even true, as it has been, obviously, for the people of Baghdad for a number of weeks. I really wonder what we would think of the government and the leadership that had brought such a catastrophe upon you and everyone you know. That's my roundabout way of saying welcome to Iraq, which is the subject for my 4 colleagues tonight. The war caused a lot of damage in many different forms. Even the meaning of some words has been changed by the war. If I say Europe, I don't think it means what it did a year ago. If I say the Allies, the meaning of that too has changed. The one thing that hasn't changed is the situation that's the source of many of the problems in the Persian Gulf and the Middle East, and that's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Saddam Hussein and the government of the Ba'ath are gone, but the fuel that helps propel every jihadist, every would-be suicide bomber, every attack against Westerners, whether in Riyadh, Nairobi, or Casablanca, or here, is in part the mistrust, fighting, and fear that has paralyzed the leaders in Israel and the Palestinian territories. My colleagues are going to talk about how the damage from the Iraq War might be repaired and what's ahead for Iraq, the American military, and American diplomacy. Let me introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. Each of them will talk about 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll take questions as they come. John Murphy is the paper's Africa's correspondent. He was embedded with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. They started in Kuwait, crossed into Iraq, traveled north to Baghdad with a lot of firefights along the way, and John remained in Baghdad for a number of weeks after that. Tom Bowman is the Sun's Pentagon correspondent. He's written extensively about how the war was planned and fought, and about the tensions between some of the armed service chiefs and the Secretary of Defense. Mark Matthews, who many of you know, is the paper's diplomatic correspondent. He chronicled the diplomatic battles and the considerable wreckage in Washington and the Security Council. Todd Richissin is the Sun's European correspondent based in London. He reported from southern Iraq from the beginning of the war and then bushwhacked his way to Baghdad. Let's start with Mr. John Murphy.
I was one of the about 600 embedded journalists with the U.S. military. I was one of about 100 traveling with the U.S. Marines. And I ate their pressed chickens and horrible meals, these ready-to-eat meals, slept in fighting holes, and spent much of my time, 90% of my day, in the back of a Marine troop carrier traveling from Kuwait to Baghdad. And with all the chaos going on in Iraq today and the tension between the Iraqis and the American forces, I keep on thinking back to the early days of the war, the first days when we crossed into Iraq, and how optimistic the Marines I was traveling with were about this war. We were greeted by thousands of Iraqis who lined the road, cheering, blowing the Marines kisses, giving the thumbs up sign. You probably saw that on television quite a bit. And the Marines were passing out food and dollar bills. And there was all this optimism that this war was the right thing. The Marines felt good about what they were doing. They talked about how they were liberating these people. And But this honeymoon did not last long. As we pushed north, the relationship between the Iraqis and the military seemed to just unravel day by day. About a week into our trip, my convoy was ambushed, and it wasn't by the Iraqi military, it was by paramilitary groups, and the units that were traveling nearby were attacked by suicide bombers. And the result was that the Marines couldn't trust anybody. And they no longer looked at the Iraqis as people that they had freed, but people that they feared. And there was at one point, my unit even, they opened fire on a family in a car moving toward a checkpoint, and the entire family was killed, and the Marines felt horrible about it. But that didn't, this was just the first of many of these accidents to come. And among the Marines, I think everyone knew that the mood had changed about a week or so into the war. But before, when we were in Kuwait, the day the war started, the general of the Marines announced a competition that all the Marines needed to grow a mustache like Saddam Hussein. But when they couldn't figure out who the enemy was anymore, they ordered that all Marines shave their mustaches. And to the Marines' credit, they knew that they were stumbling and not connecting with the Iraqi people. My battalion then went out for one day and did a humanitarian mission in this little village. But it was unclear whether the Iraqis really wanted this help. I joined this giant convoy that had food and water and all these medics and doctors, and they were going to come into this village and help the Iraqis. But when they arrived in town, through a translator, they said, we've come in peace and we have free medical care for you today. And this big crowd of Iraqis had gathered in the street, and this old man came wagging his finger and he said, well, we have a doctor. Do you want to see him? We thought maybe you wanted help. And then the Marine said, well, no, we have water for you as well. We hear you don't have any water. But they're standing underneath a giant water tower, and the man says, well, no, we're doing fine on water too. And finally the Marines say, well, we have food for you. We have these fabulous ready-to-eat meals. And they say, well, actually, we really didn't like Saddam, but he did give us 6 months worth of food, so we're okay in that department too. So in the end, they actually did give out some medical care, and it was, they're mainly passing out aspirin to people. And what was really moving to see, though, is that there were all these children who were so fascinated to see the Marines, yet there was nothing wrong with them, so they were running behind this building and picking up pieces of broken glass and cutting their hands, and then running up to the medics and so they could get a bandage. And so by the time we reached Baghdad, despite efforts like this humanitarian mission, the relationship had completely soured. I mean, on some streets there were people cheering the convoy I was with. Other people were staring back with these faces that I can only imagine communicated hatred and resentment. And the city itself was in chaos, and I'm sure Todd will tell you more about that. All day long there were gunshots, there was looting, and the Marines I was with were not doing anything about the looting, and many of the Iraqis were wondering, why not? Why can't you help us? And they said they were not given the orders to stop that. And probably on the worst day in Baghdad was the 4 Marines in my unit were wounded when a Iraqi with a grenade came up to a checkpoint and blew himself up. And at that point, there was very few Marines that I spoke to who had anything positive to say about being in Iraq. They no longer talked about liberating the Iraqis. They just really wanted to go home. And I think they're on their way now. On one of the last days I was in Baghdad, I visited a hospital in Saddam City. And what was very moving for me is that I had spent all this time traveling with the Marines, watching all the bullets and bombs go in one direction. And in one day, I got to see a little bit of where some of these landed, who they hit. There was in this hospital an 8-year-old girl who had been shot in the stomach. A man who was barely breathing, who had been gotten a cluster bomb attack. And there was a 19-year-old student who had been hit 5 times, shot 5 times by Marines at a checkpoint when he and his friend failed to slow down quickly enough. And there was a relative standing over the bed feeding him, and he had been someone who had supported the war, just hated Saddam Hussein. And at this point, though, he was very, very confused. And he asked me, the Americans, are they here to help us or hurt us? A day or two later, the war was declared officially over. And what kept on going through my mind after I heard that is that after hearing what this relative said, are they here to hurt us or help us? I thought, well, no, the war's not over. Maybe the military campaign, as we know it, is over. But this second front of trying to win over the hearts and minds of the Iraqi people, that is a battle that's ongoing. I don't even know if it's winnable. And maybe that's something that the other people on the panel can help answer. But thank you very much for your time.
I'm here to give you the larger view of the Pentagon and what they've learned from the war in Iraq. And I think what they've learned is, it'll probably validate what Secretary Rumsfeld has already thought about where to take the Pentagon. And that is precision weaponry kills, speed kills, and information dominance kills can take down an adversary fairly quickly. And I think for America's adversaries, what they've learned from this, and what they should have learned perhaps 12 years ago, is don't mass your forces and expect to fight the United States. Or perhaps in the future, don't even let them show up at the ports and airfields in the region. Or, I think more dangerous for all of us here, take the fight to the homeland. Don't fight them on our soil. Start fighting them back in New York or Baltimore or Los Angeles. And if you look at what occurred in Iraq, some people say it's really a new American style of warfare, where precision weaponry, which was about 7% during the Gulf War, was over 70% in Iraq, particularly the Joint Direct Attack munitions, which rather than work with laser sighting or having to actually see the target, it works with the global positioning system, and you can actually just target it right to the coordinates. So, for example, during the sandstorm, which sort of stalled things for 2 days, and I don't know if you remember it, but some of the folks doing their stand-up, some of the TV reporters, behind them, it looked like an orange shield, and that was the sandstorm. You couldn't see anything. And what happened was some of the Republican Guard forces started to move during that sandstorm, believing they had cover. And they were picked up by a Joint STARS surveillance plane using its radar, got the coordinates of some of these armored vehicles, and a B-52 came by and just took them out. And they learned that they couldn't even move in a sandstorm. And information dominance is also something I think that the military learned from Iraq as well. Not only where your enemy is by picking up communications, radio, telephone communications, but by, again, surveillance aircraft, photo imaging satellites, finding out where the Republican Guard is, where some of the leaders of Iraq are, so you can take them out, as happened on the first night, March 19th, when they believed Saddam and some of his top generals were in a particular location in Baghdad, and 2 F-117s took out that compound. They don't think Saddam was taken out, but one thing is for sure, that certain top Iraqi leaders, perhaps generals, Republican Guard generals, were taken out because people out in the field were looking for direction, and they never received any direction from their leaders. And the swiftness as well was remarkable, I think. because they moved 350 miles in under 3 weeks. And the level of forces, too, was of note, too, because initially they wanted to start out with 5 divisions. They ended up with 3 divisions and only 1 tank-heavy division against 6 Republican Guard divisions, which were pretty much obliterated by air. That being said, it's easy to take down a regime, as we've found. It's harder to put a country back together. And I think this is one of the big lessons of Iraq that you're not going to hear from the podium from Mr. Rumsfeld, who repeatedly has tried to reduce the number of forces, not only in Iraq, but in Afghanistan. And as a consequence, we have some of the stories that John was just talking about. Are they here to help us or hurt us? Are there enough MPs with those combat units? And there are certainly not. Are there enough engineers to get the water running again or to get the lights back on? And there clearly were not. And as a result, what happens? People die, people are inconvenienced or scared, and people run to perhaps some people you might not want to see in positions of power, certain Shia clerics, for example, who move into that power vacuum and make it much more difficult to create a stable government again. So that's what we're faced with now in Iraq. And I think the Pentagon still is not willing to put enough forces into Iraq. There are roughly 150,000 ground forces now. Some of them, like the 3rd Infantry Division, which had hoped to come home soon, may have to stay longer. The Pentagon is pressing for its allies to pick up some of the slack here. But if you look, 2 of the largest allies, France and Germany, don't want to play. And some of the smaller allies, such as Spain, can only send 1,500 troops. That's not enough. So again, this is something the U.S. military is going to have to deal with in the coming years. If precision and information dominance means you can have fewer troops to take out an enemy, what happens when you own the real estate and you have to patrol and put it back together again? And again, the other thing I think to remember is a lot of times in war, it's the losers that learn the most. America's adversaries, perhaps, again, will not mass their forces as we saw in Iraq and have them all pretty much eliminated. They may opt for guerrilla warfare right off the bat. And they may also decide what the Pentagon is called access denial. Never even let you show up at a particular port or airfield, such as in Kuwait or Saudi. At the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, I was up there about a month ago doing a war game set in 2015. And one of the things they're looking at is access denial, where U.S. forces try to show up in an area and immediately are hit with a barrage of short and medium-range missiles, which are proliferating around the world today. So consequently, they have to break down the U.S. forces and go to maybe less improved ports, dirt airstrips, bringing in smaller numbers of forces, smaller and lighter armor. And another thing they're learning is that America's adversaries may take the fight to the homeland. So in the war games of 2015, the war fighters, the folks who were over in the Middle East fighting, or in Indonesia fighting, there's much more of a link to the homeland defense than what we see today. It's really one continuous battlefield. And that's something to ponder as well. The military might be stronger, might have more precision, might be able to take down a country in 3 weeks, but what are the repercussions of all this? Are we going to be safer 10, 15 years down the road? Or will America's adversaries take their fight to our shores? Thanks.
As the rest of the world looks at what the United States has done in Iraq, I think they are confronted with two questions. One is a question of trust, and another is a question of their own fear and the fear of other countries about the United States. First, the question of trust. Todd has written about the accounts of torture that Iraqis are finally able to reveal after being silenced for so long. We've seen footage of mass graves being unearthed. Quite clearly, I think the region and the world recognizes that the Iraqi people are better off without Saddam Hussein. But our main purpose was, in going in there, was not to make the Iraqi people better off. That was a secondary reason. The main purpose was to eliminate a threat to us and to our allies in the region and to our forces who were stationed there, and that was Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. Where are they? There is a little bit of evidence that they exist. The U.S. forces have found mobile laboratories that are empty, but there's no plausible explanation for their use other than that they were biological laboratories. In addition, on the battlefield, they found numerous protective suits that the Iraqis obviously had for a purpose. And also found had been the antidotes for chemical weapons and the injectors to use it. That is about the extent of the evidence so far. The large stockpiles of tons and tons of anthrax, botulism, also sarin and mustard gas seem to have been either destroyed or never existed in the first place. And this creates a serious problem of credibility for President Bush. Whether it resonates with the American people, I'm not sure. The accounts so far seem to suggest that it won't, but it's certain to resonate with the rest of the world and raise real questions about not only American intelligence gathering, but the way American presidents assess the most serious threats, those threats that determine whether we go to war or not, or use some other means to constrain an adversary. In addition, I think having built such a powerful case that Iraq did possess weapons of mass destruction and that they posed a threat, I think it may now be less easy for the United States to gain allies the next time it needs a coalition of the willing. There is some cynical commentary in Washington now that perhaps the WMD, the weapons of mass destruction, were not really the main reason why we went to war. I disagree with that. I think that it was almost an article of faith in Washington that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and that this was a vengeful dictatorship that, if it had enough money and enough years to develop a nuclear program, might very well use it. And it was such a strong article of faith that I think the very hard questions that are usually asked of our intelligence community, particularly by members of Congress, may not have been asked. In fact, I think most members of Congress accept it as a fact that those weapons existed. I think most of our allies, even the French, accepted it as a fact. I'm not sure the French cared, but they believed it. And in addition to that, though, there was a very strong secondary motivation for going into Iraq, and that was the belief in Washington that the entire Middle East needed revolutionary change. And after 9/11, the advocates of that belief gained a hearing and gained adherents, including Vice President Cheney and President Bush. And the view went something like this, and it still persists, and we're going to see ramifications in the months ahead. The Clinton administration, along with most American allies and many moderate Arab leaders, as well as members of the left, labor left in Israel, accepted the fact that the Israeli-Arab conflict was the #1 obstacle to peace and stability in the region, and that in itself was holding back trade, tourism, development of relations between countries in the region, and holding back prosperity. Conservatives had a much different view, and this has become kind of embedded within the Bush administration, and that is that the problem is dictatorships, hostile dictatorships that are using the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to keep their populations believing. Excuse me, I need a glass of water. Thank you. Borrow this?
It's all yours.
Mouth is dry. Thank you very much. Much better. The view among conservatives is that the real problem is dictatorships. Dictators require a conflict, require an outside enemy in order to keep their populations on edge and prevent them from directing their hostility inward towards the faults of the regimes. And this, many people see as the reason that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been prolonged, and what is needed is to get rid of the dictatorships. And Iraq did provide a very good opportunity, an oil-rich country, a very evil dictator, whose removal would cause populations elsewhere to look at their own leaders and to question what they were getting, and in time either encourage some kind of violent regime change or a peaceful regime change through the process of reform. This leads me to the second question that's been raised by the war in Iraq, and that's one of fear. We've certainly seen that Syria has been intimidated. The regime of Bashar Assad is starting to restrain the various terrorist groups that operate in Damascus and has closed offices there. Iran is also very clearly nervous. But the long-term results of this fear are impossible to gauge at the moment. Some analysts argue that having viewed the dazzling and quick success of the United States in toppling the regime of Saddam Hussein, The United States will, from now on, be unconstrained. Precise weaponry that can take out a regime without destroying a country, it gives the United States a power that I don't think the world has ever seen. The relatively low rate of civilian casualties in Iraq is something also that can be seen to give the United States greater freedom of action in the future. And some analysts have said that Iran, looking at this scenario, and North Korea also looking at this scenario, can draw from it one lesson, and that is better hurry up and get the bomb. Among America's allies, there's also the impact of fear on their relationship with us and their attempt to gauge how they're going to respond to U.S. activity in the future. The display of American military power in Iraq with one major ally and a number of smaller allies has driven home the point that the United States really doesn't need a broad collection of allies in a formal arrangement such as NATO to accomplish a lot of what it wants. A coalition of the willing might even be a fig leaf in the future. The United States can do a lot of this on its own, and I think France and Germany in particular, the leaders in Europe of international organizations, the ones that have so promoted the United Nations, and international treaties ranging from the environment to the Biological Weapons Convention, are now scrambling to figure out new ways to constrain the United States, to kind of bind us once again into the United Nations and make us learn to live with international treaties, and are looking ahead to the next adventure that the United States might undertake with an eye to trying to restrict our freedom of action. The fear that some people hoped would penetrate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and get some persuade the radicals that their time was up and they had to retreat and choose a different means of operating does not really seem to have altered the dynamics of the conflict. This is something with its own causes and its own dynamic, and as we just saw in the past few days, the level of suicide terrorism by Hamas and Islamic Jihad hasn't stopped. It hasn't gotten more momentum, but it certainly hasn't stopped. And it's clear that this is a conflict that can only be resolved by Israelis and Palestinians negotiating once again and trying to figure out a way to accommodate each other's grievances and interests. Al-Qaeda also does not appear to have been intimidated. It may have been scattered as a result of the war in Afghanistan, but its operations have long involved very lengthy planning and a great deal of care and appropriate choice of timing. The United States today just raised the alert level to orange, which is one step below the highest level of red. It's clear that whatever impact the war in Iraq had on al-Qaeda, it hasn't been restrained, and if anything, some people say, it has gained the potential for a whole new set of recruits as a result of regional anger over the long-term presence of Americans. And al-Qaeda still may prove to be as important a factor in the Middle East as a dictatorial Iraq with Saddam Hussein or a democratic Iraq without him. Thank you.
Good evening. You all look so pleasant, and yet I'm so nervous. But let me be brief, actually. I want to tell you about two different people in Iraq. And when I was trying to write for The Sun, I tried to use real people to try and give people a feel for what was going on there. So when we are talking about the future of Iraq, maybe it's helpful to go back to a couple of the people who I met. One of them I wrote about, and one of them I did not. There was a boy whose name was John. He was about 4 or 5 years old, and he was in the city of Safwan, which is in southern Iraq. This was in the very opening days of the war, and that's about as far north as I could get from Kuwait. For propaganda purposes, more than any others, and it's not being critical, that's what it was. For propaganda purposes, they brought in trucks of supplies for these people in Safwan. Now, Safwan is a Shia Muslim area and had been brutally repressed by Saddam throughout his reign, particularly since '91, when they rose up at the urging of the elder President Bush, and many of them, thousands of them, were slaughtered. When the trucks got there, the kids in the neighborhood all rushed out to them, and they started jumping up on one leg, not death to the United States, but life for Saddam, and for Saddam we will give our blood. And it went on and on and on until the food came out. They gave up their calls for we will fight to the death for Saddam, and they took the food. This one little boy, who you could tell from looking at him, aside from his skinny limbs, you can see it in their teeth when they're malnourished. And this little boy was severely malnourished. He fought these big guys and went in there and somehow came out with the water. And suddenly, the United States was this kid's best friend. While I'm looking back at that and trying to figure out what to tell you today, I thought about that boy, and I'm thinking now who does he look to? Who is he going to bind himself to now? In southern Iraq, 6 months after the war, there's a cholera outbreak, and that's because there's still not clean water, there's still not electricity. That group that was "We Are With You, Saddam," and so quickly came to the United States, when you're that desperate, I have a belief that you probably go to whoever can feed you and give you water at that particular time. I think that little boy is someone to think about when you try to consider the importance of what has to happen after the war. The other person I'll tell you about, I did not write about. He was a translator for me. He was 29 years old. He was educated in the United States for 8 years. His father was a military attaché for the Iraqi government. More than anything, when I was with him, what he wanted to do was to go back to the prison where he had been held for 6 months with his father. His father was held in an 8-foot by 8-foot cell, 10 feet across the hallway from where he was held. His father's crime was speaking out against Saddam among his friends. The family is still trying to figure out, did that constitute a crime? And if so, who snitched on him in a living room conversation? For 6 months, this man, Adid, 29 years old, listened to his father being tortured. They wanted him to listen so that his father would tell all secrets that he had. Well, I believe this Adid when he told me his father had no secrets. We went from his father's cell into his cell, and Adid was very okay with it. I was very surprised at his reaction. It was, oh, I can see it now, and oh, the prison is empty. Isn't that a great thing? Well, when we got back to the car, he didn't say a word. He sat in the front seat, and for the entire 20 minutes back to our hotel where he was dropping me off, he cried. There wasn't a word I could say to him. It wasn't even, you couldn't say, it's okay. That wasn't even appropriate. Silence was appropriate. A day later, he apologized for it. And he told me that he wasn't prepared for it, that he thought that would do him some good, but he didn't think it would. Now, I tell you that story is a way to tell you that this is an American, educated young man, very thoughtful, who has every reason in the world to despise Saddam Hussein. But by the time I was leaving Iraq, he was asking me, Todd, why are they waiting? Why is there no electricity? The damage that was done with the false start from Jay Garner and his group cannot be measured. Iraqis have lost total faith in the United States in many, many parts of the country, not the least of which is Baghdad, which is becoming more dangerous as these recent days go by instead of less. Basra may be improving. I don't believe that Baghdad is. So when we consider the next phase of this, and if there's any reason to think that the war is over, I think it does everybody some good to consider that little boy named John and then this older young man named Adid. Thanks.
We'll be happy to take, if this comes on, we'll be happy to take any questions. If people want to come up to the microphones here, and we'll just go left to right. If you could just come on up to the microphone, that would help.
One of the things that's most disturbed me about this whole Iraq affair is the very strong sense I have that my own government has been deceptive, less than candid. And whether this is deliberate or a mixture of deception, misinformation, or simple incompetence, I don't know. But there are two things I'd like to ask you. Are there any credible estimates or counts of the casualties on the Iraqi side, both military and civilian, killed and injured? And two, I've seen no serious discussions of the geostrategic motives behind the American moves into Iraq. Do you know of any of these?
The LA Times recently did a story that estimated about 1,700 Iraqi civilians killed, about 8,000 wounded. But some feel that that number could rise quite a bit after Red Crescent and the International Red Cross does a little more thorough search and interviews and so forth over the coming months. Maybe by summer they might have a better estimate. I kept asking people at the Pentagon if they had any estimate of how many Iraqi soldiers were killed. And they looked at me blankly and said, that's just not something we do. All we care about is that the regime has ended and we have presence in the country. That's all they cared about. As far as the WMD, I mean, it's still an open question. What is in the country and what was destroyed, what they had in the first place. A lot of the information they did receive, well, first of all, Iraq admitted clearly that they had sarin, they had anthrax, and they had some other chemical and biological weapons. The question is, did they destroy it all? A lot of the information that the U.S. government did receive came from Iraqi exiles, so the question is, was this good information? How was this information suspect? And then the mobile labs that they found, they appear to be promising. There seems to be no legitimate reason for these labs. Also, they were painted in military colors and they were with active Iraqi troops, so that's suspicious. I guess one of the questions also is, does this constitute an imminent danger if you have some sort of a mobile lab with Iraqi troops, an imminent danger against the United States? And that's a question that's still out there.
I'm having trouble understanding how an embedded reporter can really do his job effectively. And when I was in the military in the late 60s, early 70s, I don't think an embedded reporter could have really, if he wanted to do his job, could have done a good reporting job. So I have a question to him as to how good a job as a reporter he thinks he did. But I also have a larger question for the panel, and that is, and I have a sense from some of the people around me, you know, as a citizen, I need good information to make good choices. And I don't get the sense that I'm getting good information from reporters. Now, you are all good reporters, and you do your job, but the question is, are the things that you have to say, are they getting to the larger audience through either you or through the other reporters in this country? Are reporters doing a good job of telling us what's really going on?
Well, to answer your first question, the embedding process is certainly a very new relationship between the media and the military, and I think overall it went pretty well. And you're very right that it's an imperfect relationship. I mean, there were many days where I felt like I really wasn't getting any information. And I don't know if you read my stories, but most of them, it was mainly about what I saw and the people that I spoke to, and I wasn't always able to talk to the Iraqis, obviously, and I wasn't able to paint a full picture, but it was the best option out there. I have to say, I had a fairly good experience with the Marines I was traveling with. They never tried to read my stories or cut my communication in any way, which is something that did happen to some reporters out there. I think the only way in which they blocked what I was trying to do is that I wasn't always getting good information or any information about the larger picture of what was going on around me, about the threat, 5 miles down the road, or how many people were killed. And a lot of times they were just telling me that the truth, that they didn't know.
As someone who was in Kuwait for the beginning of the war and then in Baghdad, I've never really understood, to be honest with you, the criticism of the embed program, because we didn't approach it as an either-or thing. Either we'll have embeds and take what this person can see or not. It was a supplement to broader coverage, I hope, and I think it worked very effectively. If you think back to the first Gulf War, try and remember how many casualties you saw from that war. I can remember one picture from Newsweek when there was a soldier in the plane with his buddy who was in a body bag. That's the only picture I can remember. I think with the embed program, what you got is a little bit more of a realistic taste of what war really is. So that part, I think, is easily answerable. The part, are we getting good information to our readers? I like to think we are at the Sun. The only American news station we had when we were in Baghdad, and this happened toward the end of my month there, was Fox News. I'm not going to make any judgments about Fox News, but I'll let you make your own judgment. Are people getting good information? That's the #1 cable news station in America right now.
Has any decision been made as to whether the Iraqis would be allowed to default on their debts to the French and the Russians or cancel American contracts once the cash flow from oil operations has resumed, or is this something that is too important to believe to the Iraqis?
It hasn't finally been determined. Just today, there's a revised UN resolution that's going before the Security Council, and it may be voted on before the end of the week. And under that Security Council resolution, the United States and Britain are given full control over Iraqi oil for the foreseeable future until a legitimate government is established and recognized. And the United States is going to have a lot to do with that. So for the moment, the United States and Britain are the occupying power, and they are going to control Iraqi oil. There has been some messy deal-making at the UN to basically by the vote of Russia, and also, I think, encourage the French to come along by assuring them that their contracts under the Oil for Food program will be honored over the next few months, that they won't lose out on very substantial contracts that they had before the war. It looks as though that resolution is going to pass. As for the debt, there is quite a bit of support around the world for the idea of rescheduling the Iraqi debt, shrinking the amount of reparations that Iraq owes, and it's going to be worked out in the months ahead by the Paris Club, which is the major industrial nations that hold most of the third world debt. And Russia even is willing to discuss it, willing to talk about some reduction in Iraqi debt. I hope that answers your question.
What happened to Saddam Hussein? Is he dead or alive? And Omar bin Laden and Jimmy Hoffa, everybody's disappearing. And we never get the corpus delicti. I don't understand it. So I just wonder, what is your consensus? Is he dead or alive?
I don't have the first idea. But to put a serious point on a good question, there are still people in Iraq who fear that Saddam is still alive. It still has not evaporated. I left a week ago, and it was not uncommon to hear that. So, where he is in truth, I don't know, but I think it is a serious point that people there, some of them, do still think he's alive.
I believe if they didn't get Hussein on the first bombing run on the 19th, they probably got him on the second one. I think it's likely bin Laden is still alive, because the intelligence community said if you were dead, you'd probably know about it by the chatter in the intelligence community. And Hoffa, I believe, is in the Meadowlands.
I think the panel's comments have been indeed thoughtful, and I think their direct answers to the questions are appreciated. It was truly, I think, an absolutely splendid panel, a thoroughly enjoyable evening, and truly informative. It was a discussion that it was very good to be part of. Thank you very much, gentlemen.